Good afternoon to all our virtual attendees, and I hope you're sitting comfortably wherever you are. Today I'm going to discuss the potential hidden cost of COVID-19 and how this may be identified. My name's Andrew Cushion and I'm Managing Director of Twice Too Much. I founded the company in 2003. Twice Too Much specialise in spend recovery auditing, reviewing clients' historical spend, identifying potential overpayments, and working in partnership with them to recover money back. Over the last 18 years, we've worked with many organisations, both in the public and private sector, reviewing millions of invoices, and to date, have been successful in recovering in excess of £100 million on their behalf. We provide the time, resource, and expertise that many in-house teams cannot justify resourcing internally. I'm looking to provide you with illustration of what's changed over the last year and some of those changes that have occurred within all our lives, both personal and working lives, that could have an impact on the risk to our organisations, particularly within the supplier payments environment. And I'm sure many of these challenges will be familiar to you. I would then like to go through some actual examples so that you can consider whether these situations are occurring in your organisation, particularly in the current climate. We will then look at how Crown Commercial Services have considered and addressed the risk of overpayments and fraud in the public sector, specifically due to COVID-19, and how they have come up with a variation to an existing framework to provide public sector bodies with a means of reviewing their commercial transactions during this period. Taking into account this framework variation established by Crown Commercial Services, we look at how we would call a health check may provide the solution for organisations, and we consider how this might work in practice along with the potential benefits.
Please leave your number and a message, and we'll return your call as soon as possible.
So whilst furlough may not have had the same direct impact within the public sector, the impact of sick leave is still applicable, and just as important has been the impact of furlough on the day-to-day relationships with suppliers. I trust that a number of the examples are only too recognisable during our current lockdown especially, but I'd also like to assure you that I wasn't the man in the video clip. I'm sure that at some time most of us has experienced these issues, and whilst Teams meetings etc. have been very useful to keep in touch and to communicate, they have at times been very challenging in their own right, and I'm sure you will appreciate that. Clearly, one of the biggest challenges has been the changes in processes or workflow, which potentially has created greater risk of the same invoices being authorised by different managers. Along with different processes for scanning and inputting of invoices, it is almost impossible to identify potential errors and therefore quantify the impact.
All operators are busy at this time. Please hold. All operators are busy at this time. Please hold.
Particularly at the beginning of the pandemic, there was a huge urgency to purchase PPE to protect our staff. As a result, demand was far in excess of supply, with the inevitable impact on cost. However, are you paying the same price now for your PPE as you were in the beginning? Along with the race to procure urgent supplies came the need for payment up front, predominantly from credit cards, but also in the form of pro forma invoices. How did your organisation deal with this challenge? I now want to share with you some actual examples that we have come across during our recent reviews, particularly covering the period of the pandemic, that I feel are likely to be occurring in many organisations across the country and no doubt worldwide. Hopefully these examples will provide you with some food for thought for you to share with your colleagues and consider from a practical point of view how they may be identified within your present controls and processes. This specific example highlights the risk of overpayment when a supplier raises two completely different invoices, albeit virtually with the same supplier number, via two divisions of its businesses. As a result, the invoices were processed by the accounts payable team as normal on receipt of them. Our observations, having reviewed millions of transactions on behalf of our clients in the last year, is that there is a significant increase in instances of suppliers raising invoices like this one here, especially where suppliers have group companies and subsidiaries. And due to COVID-19, many of the departments have been subject to furlough and responsibility for invoicing transferred between group companies. In addition to this, due to an increased number of people within the business available to authorize, and due to changes in processes and responsibilities, both invoices were actually paid. This example is particularly pertinent as the invoices were for face masks. One of the key challenges is that due to COVID-19 and the requirements to spend significant unbudgeted amounts in this respect to protect our staff, normal controls in terms of comparing spend with budgets were and are ineffective. The identification and keying of zeros and O's is one of the most common errors anyway, even pre-COVID. But this has no doubt become even more prevalent as a greater number of staff are involved in helping out with processing and with the additional challenges of working from home. Similarly to the last example, the identification and keying of ones and I's has always been a common error that cannot be picked up easily by controls within most finance systems. Errors in keying like this mean that from a system point of view, they are treated as different invoices and therefore not identified as potential duplicates. Again, the challenges of working from home, trying to key invoices from scanned images, increases the likelihood of these types of errors being made. The introduction of scanning in many organisations over the last few years has clearly led to savings in processing costs. However, scanning is obviously significantly dependent on the quality of the invoices provided by suppliers. Only too often do poor quality invoices lead to resultant errors in how the invoice number would appear in your finance system. With COVID-19, the sharing of responsibilities, often with reduced staffing in offices, has led to an increase in risks around the same invoices being scanned or manually keyed with differing results. The example shown here demonstrates that a simple misscan can result in a supplier being unable to identify the correct invoice number being paid and accordingly chasing for payment of an apparently unpaid invoice. I think that we all appreciate, with the present distractions, particularly with the challenges of working from home, this particularly can have an impact on concentration, leading to an increased likelihood of input error. This is not to say that these types of errors in keying would not have happened prior to the pandemic, but many of these instances would simply not have occurred within the normal office environment. Identifying what the supplier's actual invoice number is and always has been a challenge, especially within the public sector environment, where there is more purchasing of services as opposed to product or stock items. In our experience working with councils and the NHS, there is a greater prevalence of narrative invoices rather than actual invoice numbers. To conclude regarding these types of overpayments that we have seen during the last year, it is clear that the normal checks and balances that may have stopped overpayments in the past would appear to have been less effective with the changes in working practices and the challenges of working from home. Finally, historically, most suppliers were quite good at acknowledging when they had received overpayments, and some even paid the money back. But in the current financial crisis, it appears that many suppliers are now waiting for organisations to find these overpayments for themselves. How many of the examples shown could be occurring right now in your organisation, and how would you go about finding them? So, addressing the risk of overpayments. Having discussed the risks, I now want to cover the potential solution that is available to all public sector bodies. For a number of years, a framework has been in place established by Crown Commercial Services to enable public sector organisations to procure spend analysis and recovery services. This is known as RM3820, SARS for short. However, this framework, like many frameworks you are likely to have come across, often involves a significant amount of internal resource and time. COVID-19 created a situation that required UK public sector to rapidly source goods and services, sometimes in high volumes and occasionally from previously unused suppliers. Additional pressures were also brought about by unfamiliar home working restrictions, and in many cases there was a need across the public sector to support financially struggling supply chains. All of these factors together make public sector commercial activity for this period uniquely different from what would be considered business as usual. It is therefore considered appropriate for Crown Commercial Services to provide those public sector bodies with a means to review this short period of commercial transactions that concerned COVID-19. Accordingly, they established a variation to the existing framework agreement relating to spend analysis to facilitate these reviews in November 2020. This specific variation was formally confirmed by the Cabinet Office. So to address the variation, Crown Commercial Services utilised the existing framework agreement as a route to market for public sector organisations that wish to review their COVID-19 related spend, in order to identify the instances of potential fraudulent activity or erroneous payments to third-party suppliers. The key points of the variation are as follows. The scope and the scale. The scope and scale of the review and what is or is not COVID-19 related spend is left up to individual public sector organisations themselves and therefore was not specifically defined. This variation enables a limited fixed cost review focused on reviewing the COVID-19 period, and I'll be explaining in more detail later how we would see this review working in practice. There is also the ability for the contracting authority to embark on a further, more detailed review, widening the scope as required, but utilising the existing framework charging structure based on a percentage of recovered funds, so therefore is no direct cost. There is also a specific requirement as part of the variation that should a further review take place under the framework agreement, the previous cost for the 10-day review can be offset against future fees. So the contract variation benefits. Firstly, there's a short procurement process. This compares favourably against the much longer historical procurement process for the full framework agreement. This simply enables you to procure from any of the suppliers listed on the framework via a direct award, and it's a legally compliant route to market. Secondly, the fixed cost of a 10-day review is therefore a known upfront cost. The initial fixed cost, as I've said, can be directly reimbursed against benefits should a full review take place. It is appreciated that there are limited internal resources available to either undertake reviews of this type or in assisting third parties to carry out such a review. By limiting the review in terms of both scope and time, the requirement for internal resources is significantly reduced. If there are any issues, the earlier they can be identified, the quicker a solution can be implemented and potentially money saved. I previously worked in the NHS and I'm only too aware of the pressure on resources and budgets. This pressure is likely to be exacerbated in 2021 and beyond. In reality, most overpayments, once identified, can be recovered, which could significantly help at a time when there are likely to be even more pressure on public services. So to illustrate how this variation might work in practice, we have established what we call a health check, designed to achieve the objectives of the variation discussed in the 10 days stated and providing the maximum benefit to clients with the minimum need for client resource and their valuable time. So firstly, data. We have extensive experience assisting clients with data extraction. All data is validated by us to ensure completeness and accuracy prior to any analysis being performed. The data period is reduced for these health checks to a maximum of 2 years, enabling identification of issues during the COVID period, but also helping with comparisons of spend both pre and during the pandemic. Secondly, the review. The review side of the health check is probably the most important in that clients can benefit directly from the experience of specialists in this field, along with the analytical expertise and technological resources used to analyse these client transactions. These reviews are performed off-system, off-site and out of site, enabling clients to continue focusing on their core activities. Results will then be validated and finally confirmed on your behalf. Thirdly, reporting. Key to any reviews of this type are the results, along with identifying potential overpayments and highlighting the types of errors occurring. Best practice solutions can be recommended to enable future risk to be mitigated. There are also recommendations regarding next steps with regards, as discussed, to a more in-depth review as necessary. Finally, supplier analysis. This is an addition to most reviews performed, but one we feel is particularly important during this current pandemic. As we are all aware, at the beginning, there was an urgent need to procure PPE of various types, urgently and often in great quantities at a time of limited supply. There is now a need to look back and establish improved control over recent contracts and consider whether current suppliers now provide best value. We believe a high-level supplier analysis can assist significantly with this process. So, health check benefits. It meets the objectives of the contract variation in full. It's maximum benefit for minimum resources. It's intended to be a light touch approach with minimum requirement for internal resources. They should highlight the risks and challenges that are occurring in your specific organisation. The spend activity analysis could highlight not just potential overpayments or fraud, but also other issues that need to be addressed with suppliers. And the initial health check will highlight potential opportunities should a more comprehensive review be applicable. And in conclusion, identifying. Every organisation will be different in how the pandemic has impacted on them. The challenge is to identify what the issues are and attempt to quantify the impact of those issues. Resourcing. All organisations, without doubt, are going to be under significant pressure, both now and for some time to come. The use of resources, both internal and external, to identify and address these issues must be appropriate and effective. Solving. Clearly, if there are issues, they need to be addressed. My honest opinion is that very few organisations will be unique in having the challenges discussed today, and there is a way forward in sharing experiences and identifying best practice solutions together. You will not be alone. And finally, we are here to help. Please feel free to make contact with me both during the conference and afterwards. And if you'd like a copy of the presentation to share with colleagues, I'll be happy to help. I hope that after the Q&As you enjoy your virtual lunch and the rest of the conference. And thank you for your time.